Breakfast has become a signature event at the BC Natural Resources Forum, and it is really unique, and we appreciate everyone's willingness to participate. So just a reminder, I see the questions are coming in on Whova already, so you might want to get in there, and usually the questions that get in early and get upvoted are the ones that do get asked. And so now I'd like to call Tristan Goodman, the President and CEO of the Explorers and Producers Association of Canada, to the stage to introduce this morning's moderator on behalf of our session sponsor, Tourmaline. So please join me, Tristan.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Nice to see you. Excellent. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to just acknowledge that we are on the sovereign and unceded territory of the Clélé-Dene. And also, I'd like to thank Prince George for hosting this. It's fabulous, beautiful city. I'd like to thank Tourmaline as well for sponsoring this breakfast, and also for sort of showing a more collaborative approach and allowing me to speak on behalf of the Canadian energy industry. This is going to be a fantastic panel. This really is, with First Nations leaders and nations, the group that is really setting the vision and the outcomes for where things are going to end up in the natural resource space within British Columbia. And there's actually quite a lot of positive that I think many of the ministers and BC can take that have been done actually very well. I mean, we heard yesterday an investment of $36 billion. That's remarkable. And it's really remarkable around three key things. It is about climate, Indigenous, and competitiveness. And Premier Eby has this goal within those three elements, and I think these ministers clearly exemplify that, from the great work of Minister Rankin with DRIPA, and now the work with Minister Osborne on trying to get things moving and to figure out climate and where to end up on that with Minister Heyman and others. So it's quite impressive. Of course, there's also some challenges, we know that. And I think really it's about looking for, as we go through this process, what is really going to work, making sure that as the implementation occurs, we're going to hit some tactical hurdles, and there's going to have to be a few pivots to make that work for everybody. And finally, and most importantly, I think when you look around the world, and this is the key sort of piece, BC really isn't where it could be on the investment front. Everybody here needs those dollars flowing in, and that has to be a continuous thing. So I really look forward to seeing what the ministers have to say on that, and to sort of ensure that all communities across British Columbia are supported. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 21st annual, hold it up, Sarah's telling me to do. Closer. Okay, cool. I have a loud voice according to my family, so hopefully you can hear me. Welcome, everyone, to the 21st annual BC Natural Resources Forum. My name is Carolyn Chisholm. I'm the General Manager of External Affairs for Rio Tinto, Canada. Based in Ottawa, as Shannon said, I'm from Ottawa. But I'm actually from Nova Scotia, where the natural resource industry is just as important to my part of the world as it is here in British Columbia. In fact, I was telling one of the ministers just now that my niece was born in Tumbler Ridge in the mid-90s, so I definitely have connections to this part of the world. I want to say that this is an absolutely incredible opportunity. As someone who's worked in external affairs for 20 plus years, I have never, ever in my life seen 6 ministers be at an event for 3 days in a row. That is an incredible commitment of time and a real sign of the importance of the natural resources industry to your government and to this province. And we've heard Premier Eby say on Tuesday night that the road to prosperity in British Columbia goes through the natural resources industry. And when the natural resource industry is doing well, we all do well. And this is, as I say, my first forum, and I couldn't help but feel the sense of optimism and the positive spirit after hearing the Premier's speech. I really took a pulse of the audience the next day, and people were feeling really optimistic with what they heard. First, because the Minister made some pretty significant announcements, with $36 billion being one of them, for electrification. Because the road to decarbonization on heavy industries like ours, like Rio Tinto, energy is fundamental. So that's an incredibly important investment. It starts with clean energy. But there was also a real acknowledgement by the Premier of the challenges. And he really called that out, particularly in the forest industry. And that we all have to work together as one, and many have said this, to really be action-oriented and to get to yes. And so that's what we're going to try to talk about today. We have 6 engaging people on this stage, which I'll introduce. I'll ask a few questions, but you don't want to hear too much from me. We want to actually hear from you and to really dig deeper into the comments and questions that the Premier's already talked about and Minister Osborne has talked about, but want to hear from others as well. So, just a quick introduction for those who don't know these ministers, but I find that hard to believe that that's not the case. So we have on my left, Brenda Bailey, Honourable Brenda Bailey. Now, I want to make sure I get the portfolios right. The MLA for Vancouver Falls Creek and Minister for Jobs, Economic Development and Innovation. The Honourable Nathan Cullen, MLA for Stikine and Minister for Water, Lands and Resource Stewardship. The Honourable George Heyman, MLA for Vancouver Fairview and Minister of Environment. The Honourable Josie Osborne, this is her 3rd time on stage, I think, MLA for Mid-Island, Pacific Rim and Minister of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation. The Honourable Murray Rankin, MLA for Oak Bay, Gordon Head and Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. And finally, but not least, the Honourable Bruce Ralston, MLA for Surrey, Whalley, and Minister of Forests. So we have about 50 to 60 minutes. And as I said, I don't want you to just hear from me. I really hope you have some questions, although I see we have lots of questions. So thank you for getting us started. But I'm going to, in the spirit of giving ministers sufficient time to have their say, I'm going to start off with a single question that I like to ask people when I moderate panels, and really it's their opportunity to tell us what's on their mind, and each minister will answer this one in turn, and then we'll have some targeted questions to be able to dig deeper into subjects. So my first question to all ministers, and we'll go left to right this time, what keeps you up at night?
Hi, good morning, everyone, and congratulations for being here so early. It's a nice big room. What keeps me up at night? So my portfolio is jobs, economic development, and innovation, and there's a lot of things in that portfolio that can keep one up at night. The piece that I'd like to speak a little bit about this morning is the economic development piece. It's so important, and one of the things I think about that takes some pondering is the challenge of ensuring that young people in British Columbia will have as much opportunity or more opportunity than we did. And that's not a small challenge. And I think it's really important. You know, I grew up in a small town, and I spend time, because of this portfolio, in many small towns meeting up with people, that we have well-paying jobs in every part of our province. And so that's really one of the questions and challenges in front of me in my portfolio that we're working on really diligently. We've got a number of tools that we can employ. We've got our Reddit program and manufacturing jobs, and it's been really heartening to see how communities have used those programs to ensure that they're able to keep young people working in their communities and stay vibrant. Lots more to do on that, but that's certainly something that I ponder at 2 a.m. when I wake up. Thanks.
Mr. Cullen?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's a very pertinent question. The direct answer is the guy in room 412 last night who
Other than fire alarms.
No. It displayed a capacity to make noise while snoring that defied human biology. I swear, I couldn't. I'm usually a pretty. We travel a lot. Excuse me, and you know, this happens. I try to stay pretty zen about it. I took to pounding on the wall to see if that would help. That wasn't zen at all. It literally kept me up a bit last night. The other nights, when I'm not at the Treasure Cove beside room 412, the answer is water. Water everywhere, but not when we need it, not enough. And what do we do as a province? What do we do collectively in this room? What do we do to the people in our lives? Because we all play a part. I'm looking at mayors, industrial leaders, us as leaders in the province, because this is a vexing challenge. We talk about wicked problems sometimes. This is one. And this is one that we're going to have to collectively face together. What do we do in times of drought that still we're experiencing in the Northeast right now? What do we do when the water comes too much all at once? How do we hold water back on the land so that when the droughts come, we're able to mitigate them? And as somebody who lives in the North, the impacts of wildfires and the worry of wildfires, not just on industry and planning, but on our communities and the security that we need to have, keep our families safe, that's what keeps me up. I know we can tackle this, but this is truly a collective challenge. And how do we do that together in a really intelligent way so that we have that kind of bright future that we need water? And we never thought we'd worry about this much on the West Coast, but boy, do we now. Thanks.
Mr. Heyman?
Thank you. Well, you stole my best line about 4 a.m. fire alarms. And I don't want to be particularly boring, but what I think about at night, or what keeps me up, is my file, basically. And the challenge is to make meaningful and steady progress toward meeting our emission reduction targets in a way that builds a healthier economy in British Columbia, not inhibits the growth of a healthy economy and jobs. And I grew up in British Columbia, and I know how fundamental the resource sector is to the economy of British Columbia, and I've worked in it. Those are my first jobs as a young person. So I think about that, and I think about how to communicate effectively to British Columbians that if we think ahead and we plan and we start actions in a timely way, we will in fact make progress on climate change and seize opportunities in a changing worldwide economy and leave British Columbia a healthier place in every way.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Osborne?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having us here again. I appreciate the question, and the last 3 days with the meetings and the conversations that I've been having, what I'm really hearing is what's keeping everybody else up at night. And it's about listening to that. And our government is so focused on listening to industry, to business, and to people to understand what's keeping everybody up at night. And we know that for people, it's affordability issues, it's inflation, it's the impact of not being able to find affordable housing and worrying about supporting your families. But as a government too, we understand that what we have to do and what we are doing is taking action on that so that we can all sleep better at night. So in my file, that's around things like standing up the critical, or pardon me, I'm going to get to that in a second. That's about standing up the Clean Energy and Major Projects Office to bring together resources to help us in this transition as we move towards a cleaner economy. It's about focusing on the critical mineral strategy, which we're going to have so much more to say about soon, and really unlocking the potential for critical minerals here in BC. It's about working with First Nations and the federal government, about increasing our regulatory efficiencies and increasing our competitiveness as a destination for investment, and continuing to focus on the things that people and business need. So that helps me sleep better at night. But this is why we're here, is to share all of these stories and then to work together to take action to solve these problems that face us all.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Rankin.
Thanks, Carolyn. And it's great to be back here at the Natural Resources Forum. I just want to say thanks to you for moderating, and thanks to the organizers. I want to thank Chief Darlene Logan and Blakely Tanay. It's just been a terrific event. I'm so glad to be here. What keeps me awake at night is what keeps everyone else here on the stage up at night. But through the lens of First Nation reconciliation, which is a big concept and a difficult one to get your head around. Our goal is to try to ensure that First Nations are rooted in the modern economy and have a foothold in natural resource development. Tristan talked about the importance of investment in British Columbia. We're going to need more capital. He's absolutely right. But one of the things I think that's going to attract capital is ESG and commitment to some of those things. And for me, the S is Indigenous, that we need to ensure that industry across the world, investors understand that we in British Columbia are taking our relationship with First Nations seriously on the land, that there's economic opportunity that's shared, and that we do the right thing in reversing 175 years of colonialism in this province. What keeps me up at night, thank you. Keeps me up at night is the tension between trying to do everything right away and then causing all sorts of reaction to that, but making sure, on the other hand, that we make serious progress, because governments have only 4-year mandates and we can't do it all at once, but we can certainly make significant progress. I am so proud of a document that was unanimously supported in the legislature before I was elected, called the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. We're the first jurisdiction in North America to do this. Federal government has followed up. And our government is committed to every one of the 89 actions that are under the umbrella of the Declaration Act. The action plan that'll, I think, make lives better on the ground for Indigenous people and help with the kind of work on reconciliation that we need. I just want to say that natural resources is a central component of that. And so my role is to make sure that First Nations are fully engaged in that as we work better, as I said, to reverse colonialism and move forward together in a better way.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Ralston.
Great, thanks very much. Good morning. I love this conference. I've been coming for many years, and I always learn a lot from being here. And I just want to say it's entirely appropriate that we're here in this building, because the forest industry heats this building literally. There's, down at Lakeland Sawmills, there's a boiler that uses sawmill residue, heats up hot water. It's piped under the CN tracks down to 12 buildings here in the downtown core. So aside from the human warmth that you are generating to heat each other, the building is being heated by the forest industry. And I think that's really an appropriate metaphor. That's really an appropriate metaphor for what we're doing here at this conference. But I'm going to take the question as more a metaphorical one rather than a literal one, unlike some of my colleagues, and just say that what I worry about is the impact of all the various natural changes that have taken place, whether it's forest fires, whether it's the pine beetle, the spruce beetle, whether it's the decline in the annual allowable cut, and also the fluctuation of market prices. Those all have an impact on the forest industry. But what I think people are looking for from us, and you heard the Premier talk about this on Tuesday night, is a sense of the impact of many of the policies that we brought in, and you've heard from my colleagues about those. And I think what people are looking for is a moment of increasing stability, and from that stability, predictability for the business environment, and so that forest communities, for the families, for the workers, for Indigenous communities, we can all have a better sense of what's in our future and how we can better plan for it and create the kind of prosperity from our resources that we enjoy in British Columbia and we will continue to enjoy thanks to the natural resource sector. So that's what I would say here this morning, quite so early in the morning. Thank you.
Thank you, ministers. That is pretty good for 7:45 in the morning after a 3-day conference, so thank you. I want to pivot a little bit, and I'm going to approach these questions as targeting ministers, and then if others have points they would like to add, please feel free to jump in. But my next question is really talking about we have in the British Columbia government leaders when it comes to embracing the principles of ESG, and signified by the Clean BC program and leaders on DRIPA as a way to create that stable investment climate for the resource industry. And, you know, as a company like Rio Tinto, we completely agree with that. But the reality is, in Canada and in British Columbia, it is a high-cost jurisdiction relative to other places in the world. And capital is fungible. It will go where it can make the best return. What more do you think we should be doing as a government to close that investment gap that we've heard folks in this room talk about today? And I'm going to maybe start with Minister Heyman, and then I'll turn to Minister Cullen.
Thank you. I mean, that is probably the fundamental question for many people in this conference, and has been for a number of years. I think what I regularly hear from business leaders and industry representatives with whom I meet is two things. People need to know they'll be able to make a profit, and people need some stability and certainty about what the rules are going some years into the future. Instability is not conducive to investment. So what we've tried to do in developing the various measures to reduce emissions under the climate plan, for example, but it's also true for other regulatory regimes that some of which are in my ministry, some of which are in my colleagues' ministries, is to consult and listen to industry, First Nations, and others about what the impacts of our policies are likely to be beyond what we think the impacts will be, because it is, as everyone knows, quite possible to be a bit narrow in vision if you're focused on a particular outcome and not necessarily able to conceive of the unintended consequences. Take those other consequences into account, look for ways to adjust our policies, not to give up on the goal, but to find sensible ways to get there, workable ways to get there, ways that investors and industry can support, and then send the message that we're staying on a fairly consistent track. One of the opportunities I've had as minister is to travel internationally to UN climate conferences, and over half of my meetings there are with industry representatives. There's lots of opportunity to talk. There's opportunity to talk to investors. And while I would say, and I note the most popular question from the audience coming up about how do we get investment and support for BC resource production here within the context of our regulatory regime, there is a growing trend of international investors to want to invest in jurisdictions that are stable and predictable, which I just described, but also that have strong ESG principles that are not likely to end up without social license, because we're taking social license into account as we're developing our policies, just as we are taking into account profitability and what it takes to make investors feel secure in their investment. I think I'll just stop there.
Thanks, Minister. Minister Cullen?
I sometimes struggle between the ideas of certainty and predictability. And when I was in business, when I worked for businesses, I never really entertained the idea that there was really a lot of certainty in anything in business. No one could predictably say 6 months from now, the market's going to do this, or there's a guarantee of an investor climate like this. Predictability and the responsibility of government to become more predictable with how we're landing the reconciliation agreements that Minister Rankin is a part of, how we're making the investments like Minister Osborne is making. That's the predictability, I think, that businesses are asking us for. On our side, at WLRS, affectionately known as Walrus, which is not bad, but nothing like JEDI, Jobs, Economic Development, Innovation. Is that what you guys came up with to get to JEDI? You can tell when someone starts with the final word that they want and then just works their way backwards. How can we call our ministry something cool? Anybody?
You don't sound jealous at all.
I'm not jealous at all, because Walrus. So nimble, so beautiful and graceful. Just like government. But in seriousness, one of the mandates the Premier gave to Walrus was to overhaul the permitting regime in this province, to make it more predictable, to make it more transparent, and to make it more effective while maintaining world-leading standards. Back to George's comments about companies, investors needing to be able to know that their investments here are meeting with the highest standards, so they can turn to their shareholders and their consumers and say, when products come out of BC, they're of the highest quality. We are meeting our social obligations, our environmental obligations, and our investor obligations. That's a good thing to bring to the market and to your customers. To answer the question specifically, I'm not sure that we do enough collectively to talk about how incredible this province is, how hard we're trying at some of these really challenging questions like reconciliation, and that we're not there, but boy, are we on the right track. And that's something I think we can be a lot more proud of as the private sector also, but I would say as government as well.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Osborne, anything to add?
Thanks so much. First of all, I think it's important to take stock of the advantages that BC does have, and we've already listed so many of them in that ESG framework around the incredible environmental standards that we have here and the high expectations we have around protecting the environment. The work that we're doing with First Nations and listening to communities in setting high social standards and ensuring that the resource industry is a safe place to work. The stability and safety and security of the governance here in this province and how attractive that is for investment. We're not Panama, we're not Peru. We're a place that when you get a permit, you can count on that permit lasting for the length of a project. But we do have challenges, and that's exactly what this question is about. So when we're looking at the fiscal environment, when we're looking at tax policies here in British Columbia, when we're understanding what the costs are to get products out to ports and off into other countries that depend on them, we have challenges before us, and that's why we have to continue to take action on those. I was recently in the UK, specifically on a mission to talk to different investment houses, to talk to different companies about what was appealing to them about British Columbia and what the challenges were for investing here. And I heard so many of the things that you all know around the need to increase the permitting efficiency and the predictability of the system, so that if we're going to get to know, we get to know fast enough to know what that is, but also that we're encouraging and working with investors and with companies to get to those positive FIDs. We heard from investment houses in the UK that there's so much about British Columbia that makes them want to be here. We've got things to do to kind of tip over that FID and make sure that we get on the positive side of that. But fundamentally, and I said this yesterday when I was up here with Chris O'Reilly, one thing that really sets this jurisdiction apart from so many others is the work that we're doing with First Nations and around doing everything we can to achieve economic reconciliation, to provide the certainty, to Nathan's point too, though, around the land base and where activities can take place, and then making sure that as we work with companies to encourage all of those partnerships. And I've heard so many terrific examples, and we've seen them here throughout the conference about the work that industry is doing in partnership with First Nations to create that level playing field, which really invites more positive decisions to invest here in British Columbia. Proud of the work that everybody's doing, and our government's going to continue to stay here supporting you in that. Thanks.
Thank you, guys. Lots of great food for thought. I would just add a comment, and absolutely right, in the ESG of things, we all hope that that will generate premiums for the products that we produce. The reality at the moment, it doesn't. So the question is, what are the policy instruments that are required to close that gap until there's a time when we do get a premium for those products? So, so just some food for thought. But building on that, one of the things that I've been preoccupied with as head of external affairs for Rio Tinto across Canada is what's happened in the United States. Obviously, we're all really concerned of what's potentially going to happen in the United States in November. But looking back on how the Biden administration has really changed the game around industrial policy with the Inflation Reduction Act. And we know at a national level, the federal government has, through the Strategic Innovation Fund, which Rio Tinto has gratefully benefited from, through the commitment that the government has made for a national critical mineral strategy and infrastructure programming support for that, the Clean Growth Fund, all kinds of things. But now the real primary response for Ottawa to the Inflation Reduction Act has been the investment tax credits. We're still looking to see the details, but probably fair to say that the clean energy tax credit has been really helpful to all provinces because it was a game changer, and that provincial crown corps are eligible for that. It's a recognition that this is a national problem that needs the heft and the fiscal power of the federal government to support it. But we have seen billions and billions, like the leveraging of the IRAs and the trillions of dollars of investment going into the United States. And we've actually seen Canadian companies change their investment decisions because of the incentives that the IRA has generated, whether it's through the EV battery sector, the chip sector, and including in our sector, in the aluminum industry. We learned the U.S. government issued a ruling on what the definitions are for certain tax measures in the IRA, and it's going to support the development of the primary aluminum industry in the United States. And we've seen provinces, particularly Ontario and Quebec, really take a strategic and targeted approach to both critical and strategic mineral development and the EV battery economy. Would you say, and I'll direct this first to Minister Bailey, does British Columbia have an industrial policy?
Thanks very much for the question, and it was a really interesting framing talking about the U.S. and I just want to share an observation on that before I sort of get into the guts of the question, which is, you know, we talk a lot about ESG, and often it's the E and the S that we're very interested in. But I've met with companies who've told me the G is also deeply important. And while, of course, delighted to see the IRA because all of us want to address the challenge that is climate change. But some of the businesses that I've spoken to, and this I found deeply shocking, don't think they're around to stay. And they don't consider, I mean, someone actually said this to me, this is a very large business said to me, they don't consider the US government stable. And they don't consider those investments as stable. I found that shocking, the largest market in the world, but you can understand that sentiment. And stability is definitely something that we have here in Canada, in British Columbia. And I think that we need to pay attention to that G factor a little bit more than we have often. So yes, those are very important incentives, and are they going to stay? It's a fair question. In terms of the work that we're doing here in British Columbia, we have a number of tools that we can use to invite investment. And within my ministry, we have a major investments office, and we'll collaborate with the federal government to really leverage funding that can come in to de-risk projects. So there's a number of different areas we've been doing this work. For example, the E1 Mali investment that we recently made, $75 million from our government, $225 from the feds, and then the rest from E1 Mali for a $1 billion lithium-ion battery manufacturing plant in Maple Ridge. But there's another piece that I want to just add to this, and I know we're short on time, so I'll try to make this story quick. One of the pieces that British Columbia needs to do better is to hang on to our intellectual property, and that's part of the work that we've been doing. We've rolled out an intellectual property strategy. So IP can be many things, but the E1 Mali story is an interesting one because that IP, lithium-ion, was really developed at UBC in 1977. We were the world leaders in lithium-ion battery understanding, production. We had a company called Mali that was really leading the way. Those giant cell phones that we used to have that were like lifting weights, that was their technology. We sold early. That is such a classic British Columbia story, right? The moment there's a potential chance to sell, we do. Sold to Japan, went to Taiwan. Now it's a Taiwanese company that's investing that IP back in British Columbia. Even worse than that, the professor that originally built out this Mali company before it was bought went to work at Dalhousie, and really Tesla Motors would not have happened without his IP. So when you think about the loss of revenue across the board in that story, it's quite shocking. So part of what we're doing is really trying to think differently about intellectual property in British Columbia and what that can look like. The partnership that we can bring to the table to de-risk major investments is very, very important, and we're doing that work in a number of different priority sectors, so you'll see more of that to come.
Thank you, Minister. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to jump to one more question before I open it up to the audience. And in preparing for the session, I read Linda Cody's op-ed and on what's needed for the forest industry. And my question will be both to Minister Rankin and Minister Ralston. And Linda writes, Linda, you don't mind I'm quoting you. Further progress on revenue sharing as well as new government-to-government agreements is fundamental to support the transition in the forest industry. So I wanted to ask, starting with Minister Rankin, what update can you give us on the new fiscal framework specifically for the forest sector?
Right. Well, I just want to say I always agree with Linda Cody. You know. No, but quite frankly, I think it's central. You know, we've had a past where our relationships were transactional with First Nations. Industry and government were simply one-offs, and now we're trying to recognize that First Nations have governments and need the same steady, sustainable funding that local governments do, that provincial governments, that federal governments do. And to do that, we've tried to change the entire way of working with First Nations to ensure that we have a new fiscal framework in place. We started that about 2019, the work with the First Nation Leadership Council, and we've been moving steadily toward change in that area. Some of you will know that we put about $440 million in the hands of First Nations through gaming revenue. That's just one example where we revenue shared with the 204 First Nations of British Columbia, so they could at least depend on that funding. I mean, even when the casinos went down in the pandemic and people were not going there, we insisted on making them whole through that framework. That's one example of revenue sharing. Perhaps more importantly, though, of course, in this room would be the resource revenue sharing framework. And that's something we committed to in the action plan under the Declaration Act that I referred to earlier as one of our core commitments. So I have people in the Ministry of Finance and in my shop that are working really hard with the First Nation Leadership Council and rights and title holders to figure out what that really means. Perhaps the best place to start, though, is, Linda would agree, is in the forest sector. And so we've made significant changes and are making significant changes, starting with FCRSs, the Forest Revenue Sharing Agreements. And perhaps on that note, Carolyn, I can pass the baton to Minister Ralston.
Great, thanks very much. Yes, I would want to just reiterate the gaming agreement. That's a 30-year agreement. 7% of total provincial revenue from gaming is in a fund that's being distributed to the 204 First Nations over a long period of time. And actually, some nations have used that predictable revenue to go to their financial institution and use that to borrow. Banks obviously like predictability, and use that to borrow to engage in housing construction, economic development within their own nation. So the predictability and the stability and the predictability is really important. The forest revenue, we in 2022, the FCRSA is the jargon term. I've written it out. It's the Forest Consultation and Revenue Sharing Agreement. That doubled. And that is a very significant increase, as I think anyone would immediately appreciate. So the process of developing a long-term revenue sharing agreement is underway, but we have made, Minister Rankin, the Cabinet, the government, and Premier Eby, we have made significant strides in sharing resource revenue, which I think are long overdue reforms and have materially altered our relations with First Nations in the province in a way that's consistent with the values that the legislation that was unanimously passed in the legislature a few years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I'm going to turn it over to the questions from the audience. And I feel like we've answered some of the first one, but because it has 28 votes, I don't think I can avoid asking it. So here goes. What is it going to take to get the public to support BC resource production instead of production from countries with little to no environmental rules or rule of law, big corruption, etc.? Is it government leadership? So I'm going to ask Minister Heyman to take a stab at that one.
Thanks. I think I understand the question. I don't entirely accept the premise, because I think what we largely hear is a lot of noise from extremes, and that's what gets reflected in the media. So we hear, on the one hand, some people who say, no environmental values matter at all, we should just focus on jobs. We hear other people say we shouldn't cut a single stick of old growth, and we should cease all development that has any impact whatsoever on the environment. And the vast majority of British Columbians, and I would say everybody in our government, just reject either of those extremes. I'm reminded of a quote that was recently circulating on social media from former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, which was, Canadians are reasonable, be reasonable. So I think what we need to do, because the second part of the question is, what will it take? Is it government leadership? I think when I get letters about what are you doing about X, Y, or Z, why aren't you stopping all of X, Y, or Z, I respond with what we are doing in collaboration with First Nations, the measures that the forest industry, the energy industry, the mining industry are taking to address environmental concerns, to work with First Nations, to decarbonize, how that is valued around the world in comparison to other places that aren't taking those measures. And I think it's important for British Columbians to hear from government and all of us that people are working hard to do all these things, and the resource sector is an incredibly important part of not just the standard of living of British Columbians and jobs for their kids, but the revenue that supports all of the healthcare, education, and other services that they expect and depend on. So can we do more? Absolutely. We have to show leadership in being reasonable while addressing the concerns that British Columbians have and the concerns that industry and investors have about being viable, about having certainty, about attracting investment, and about creating jobs. And we need to communicate that every day.
Thank you, Minister. I think that's a good segue to the next question that I think Richard Prokopenko has asked. What is the BC government doing to encourage and assist young workers to move up north and work in the resource sector and stay? And I might add to that, I guess, because I have daughters who don't really like it very much that I work in the mining industry. And what's your elevator pitch to convince the next generation of workers to think about a career in the resource industry? Mr. Bailey?
Can I take a stab at that first?
Absolutely.
So I think there's a real change going on right now in how mining in particular, but resources generally, is being perceived. This old view that, you know, these are dirty jobs and an industry that's so polluting is shifting because of the work of people in this room and the adoption of sustainability principles. And I think that's more attractive to young people than the previous version of how we might have done things. And I hear this from young people all the time. And it's a reframing, I think, of how we think about folks working in industry, is that really they're part of the solution that's so important to all of us going forward. And as young people start to understand that, those jobs become more appealing. I think also so much in mining in particular is becoming so technological, and tech is cool, right? People like working in tech. And I think that that's a factor as well. And I know I've seen this in the agricultural industry. I've met farmers who said, you know, our kids didn't want to be involved in the farm. And they all went off to university to do something else. But now that we're doing X, Y, and Z, using sensors or adopting, you know, real-time data into our operations, the kids want to come home and work on that. So there's a real shift in how they perceive it. And I think that's also happening particularly in mining. And it's part of our job, I think, to help with that reframe, that these are really, really crucial jobs to the future of our province. It's contributing to reducing carbon. It's part of the solution going forward and how we, you know, how we change our economy and how we are so devoted to electrification. So those jobs are part of the solution, and I think far more appealing to young people.
I think the pitch Brenda's talking about is a good one, because if you want to see the world and you want to save the world, get into the natural resource industries, right? You want to be part of the solution in terms of the challenges on climate change, get into the natural resource industries. You want to live somewhere else and live a little bit differently and a little more adventurous life than maybe a 9-to-5, then this is a good place for you. I want to take it from the community level. As somebody who lives in a small town in northern BC, I was very glad to hear the Premier talk about a thing called the Resource Benefit Alliance in his speech the other night. For those that are not familiar, this is a negotiation we have with northern communities in the Northwest, with us as the province, about how do we share the revenues and the wealth with local communities to make things more predictable, as we were talking about revenue sharing with First Nations. Because our communities have to be livable in order for you to attract the workers that you need to come and live in them. It seems like a pretty reasonable thing. But these are a lot of small, relatively remote communities in some cases, and just don't have the revenues through small town taxation. We've done this in the Northeast some years ago. It was an NDP government that started that off, that said, a lot of investment's coming, but when you're a small town mayor, you just don't have the resources to build that nice library and the swimming pool that people want so that they can move their families there and not treat our communities like camps with a good airport. We need to do a lot more than that. And we have beautiful places to live in northern BC. We need to invest in them. And what I hear from industry is don't change our taxation rates, don't make it more, but as to where the money goes, if a little bit more can go to the local community, if a significant amount more can go to the First Nations title and rights holders, we're great. In fact, I think it helps you as industry with your social license questions about what benefits are you leaving behind? How are we building up our communities, not degrading them? And I think those kinds of programs from our government greatly assist when talking about recruiting, particularly young people, to say whether you were born and raised in a small town or you're thinking maybe life in a small town would be a good idea and work in these industries. And oh, by the way, you're gonna have outstanding facilities. You're gonna have reasonable taxation, and you can raise a family there yourself and have that excellent quality of life that some of us that have seen the light and live in small town BC have seen, because it's a remarkable life, and my family benefits from it greatly.
Excellent. Thanks, Minister. As someone who's come from a small town, I appreciate that. Next question asked by Katie. What is government's approach to the energy transition when considering the vast differences in geography and resource availability across the province? Do you agree with the panel yesterday that it's an all-of-the-above approach and that all energy sources have a place in the transition? I think that's for you, Minister Osborne.
Thank you. I'm sorry that I wasn't at the panel yesterday to hear what I bet was a really rich discussion. I mean, the short answer is that yes, I agree. It is an all of the above approach, and that we are going to need all energy sources in the transition. What we also need to understand is the endpoint that we're trying to come to, and that is one where we're creating a decarbonized, less carbon that is used as a general source of energy in our homes and in our transportation systems and in business and in industry. And how are we going to get there? There is a vast diversity of geography and resources in British Columbia, and we're really blessed because we're so rich with those. The call for power that BC Hydro is going to be releasing this spring is going to be an opportunity for us to see how we can take advantage of some of that diversity. So when we see the responses from the independent power producers in that community around solar and wind, for example, run-of-river is something that we already know we have quite a bit of here in British Columbia, and then all of that and how it will integrate into this backbone of a resilient hydroelectric system that we have in British Columbia is an example of how the transition can take place that accommodates some of that diversity. But also, you know, I think the question is getting a little bit at the natural gas system and our electricity system. Electricity obviously is a low to zero carbon source of energy that we're looking to expand. We know that we have to see electrification across the province, in all corners of the province and in all sectors of the economy and in our homes. And there are differences in the way that people can play that out in their lives. So electric vehicles, for example, we know that the uptake is huge in British Columbia. It's understandably bigger in southern British Columbia than it is in northern British Columbia. Heat pumps to use to heat our homes, again, uptake really big in southern British Columbia. And then increasingly, as technology is improving, we're seeing that come into homes in northern BC. And we know that that technology works. We also know that it's smart to have a backup system, and we see that too, for example, during the cold snap recently. And so understanding that even during that cold snap, we had record uses of electricity, but we also had almost double the energy that was heating people's homes was coming from the natural gas system. The work that we're doing through policy levers, through the innovation that companies are showing in developing renewable natural gas, the work, for example, that Fortis is doing into hydrogen blending into the system to decarbonize the gas system is all part of that energy transition. But we've got to integrate these two sources of energy. And that's why our government is developing a climate-aligned energy framework as a way to really look at how to integrate these two systems to continue to decarbonize energy and the way that we use it in our lives and in industry, because we're all trying to create that cleaner future. And I believe that everybody is deeply committed to that. We don't always agree on the different avenues and paths to get there, but we have such a collaborative way of doing that work together, whether it's through climate policies in Clean BC or economic policies through the Stronger BC Plan, the work that we're doing with the Hydro Task Force. It is going to take all of us sitting down at the table together to achieve this. And I think that's one of the strengths of a conference like this, which is bringing people together to have these difficult but exciting conversations. Thanks.
I know Minister Heyman has something to add.
I just want to briefly add to that over the last 5 years, one of the fundamental principles of Clean BC and our carbon pricing system, which is, I think, unique in Canada, is to have the Clean BC Industry Fund to co-invest with industries in a range of emission reduction technology applications. Sometimes it's electrification, but many times it's simply looking at possibilities for carbon capture, sequestration, and storages, or for more efficient energy uses. We've invested over $215 million in 5 years. We've reduced through those measures over a 10-year period about 8.7 million tons. And one of the stories that sticks out with me was visiting a small company in the Kootenays that very proudly showed us the insulation they'd put around different aspects of their energy use for drying that they had been trying to get their parent company in the United States to fund for 10 years. And the answer was always the return on investment is too slow. And when we co-invested with that company, they got the go-ahead and they reduced their energy use and their profits significantly. So that's the other side of helping the energy transition.
If I might take the prerogative as moderator to pick up on some points that were raised yesterday, I'm going to anyway, that were raised yesterday in what I thought was such an impressive panel. The three Indigenous women on that panel leading the conversation around LNG in BC. How amazing is that? I think they all should get a round of applause. But one of the comments that were raised, I think it was by Karen, was a quote saying, Canadian LNG is Indigenous LNG. And we also heard others say, we have to think about the interconnectivity of climate, and maybe BC has an obligation to think bigger when it comes to the solution it can contribute to global climate emission reductions. And I'm just wondering, Minister Heyman, not to put you on the spot again, but I will, how do you respond to that?
We do think about what's happening globally. We do look for, and in some cases help sponsor, investigation and studies into how can a whole range of BC commodities actually reduce emissions globally. BC's share of emissions globally is very small. We know that coal use and fossil fuel use in other parts of the world is significant and isn't changing fast enough. So I would simply say that we're aware of that, and at the same time, we are looking to decarbonize what we produce in British Columbia and meet our targets, because ultimately every jurisdiction in the world needs to do that. But I am acutely aware that it doesn't help anyone, least of all British Columbians, if we're the only one doing it.
Thanks, Minister. Next question by Tina. How will the government ensure that economic benefits and opportunities arising from, actually, I think I'm going to skip that one because I think we sort of answered it. I'm going to jump to the next one, sorry, Tina. When will BC catch up with Saskatchewan and Alberta and implement Indigenous loan guarantee program that will assist First Nations in participating in resource development, green energy production, and other parts of the economy?
I guess that's me.
That's you.
Some days I wish I was the finance minister so I could just say it.
Say no?
In fact, everybody on this panel wishes they were the finance minister most days. I have had conversations with both the ministers in Saskatchewan and Alberta, and I am very impressed with those programs. I know that the opposition has been talking about loan guarantee programs here in British Columbia as well. I don't know if you heard, but there was a glimmer of hope in the federal fall economic statement that they were going to go ahead with these loan guarantee programs for Indigenous nations in the resource sector. And I'm hopeful that we'll see in a few weeks in the federal budget exactly that, which will be a terrific catalyst for what might happen in British Columbia as well. Not being the finance minister, and I'll get my knuckles wrapped if I say anything more about it, but let me just say I think it's a hell of a good idea.
Great. So does Rio Tinto. With $36 billion investment in BC hydro infrastructure, Will the government and BC Hydro finally fulfill the promises made to the nations, I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce this right, Quadacha Nation, and bring them the electricity they were promised at the building of the WAC Bennett Dam?
Thank you for the question. I really appreciated the meeting that I had with Quadacha Nation at the First Nations Leadership Gathering, and in meetings with other nations too, to talk about the sharing of benefits that come from projects like the dam and other dams, from the hydro system in general, and want to speak to the work that BC Hydro is doing with First Nations to achieve reconciliation agreements and to have the difficult conversations that I know so many people in this room are so deeply committed to. When it comes to the $36 billion investment that BC Hydro has announced, that the Premier announced on their behalf the other night, around creating new infrastructure, around maintaining infrastructure, around work even in building new substations in southern British Columbia to be able to support residential housing development, it's important, no matter what type of infrastructure is being built, that those benefits are shared and that First Nations are able to take advantage of that, which is why we've been speaking around the new way of doing business and the work that Hydro is doing, for example, on the North Coast transmission line, and bringing together the 14 nations through whose territories this line will cross, and working together on collaborative governance, on an equity sharing and ownership arrangement, and making that commitment from the beginning. And that work is well underway. There is more work to do with the Quadacha Nation and other nations too, to address the impacts of historical decisions that were made in a way that we just don't do business anymore today in British Columbia. And I recognize there's more work to do, and look forward to continuing the conversation with Quadacha and with other nations. Thank you.
Minister Cullen?
Not to put you on the spot. We had an excellent conversation with some of the Nechako First Nations and regional districts, and there's another dam that Rio Tinto has that gives us the opportunity to generate power, and in fact, potentially, and this is work that we have to do together in Minister Osborne's ministry, help reconcile historical effects of the dam that helped build the smelter in Kitimat, to make whole and better the conversation of what it was. And it's easy to go back in time and say, why did we not apply today's laws and morality and ethics to a project that was designed in the 40s and 50s? That is what is. But now we have this opportunity. So this will be a good conversation between us and the private sector, and as a government and the local governments and First Nations, to say, what can we do about that particular project, the effects on the Nechako River? How do we build back the vibrancy of the environment, make right on some economic reconciliation pieces, and do good work? I think that would collectively help all of us. So we have good opportunities with Rio Tinto as well.
I think we would agree.
Oh, good.
To make sure I diversify the questions here, I'm going to go to Minister Ralston. When are we going, this seems like to put you on the spot, when are we going to see an expansion of the community forest program?
Well, thank you very much. The community forest program is a valuable program, and particularly in an era of a transitioning forest industry. Community forests uniquely combine values other than timber values. They talk about biodiversity, local jobs, and local processing. So they are a very valuable part of the forest management ecosystem. I think the challenge is, in an era when the annual allowable cut is declining, when we are concerned about other pressures on the forest landscape, creating new community forests becomes more challenging. But I've met with the association who represents community forest operators, and I'm very impressed with the work they do. So I take the comments as a further incentive to look more carefully at the future expansion of community forests. Thank you.
while I still have you, Minister, there's another forestry question. Is there a plan to fast-track the CAN4 facility in Houston to ensure that the region's residents do not leave the area looking for work elsewhere?
Thanks very much. We did talk about investment earlier, and CAN4 is a company, major forest company, I think everyone knows, with headquarters in British Columbia and international interests, whether in the United States and in Sweden. They made a significant decision working through the board to build a new mill in Houston. And I know locally, I've talked with the mayor and community representatives and the union who represents workers there, that the schedule for new construction means that there is a gap when people might be forced to leave the community and only be able to return when the new mill opens. So CAN4 is well aware of that. The union is working with them, and I know the local community is working with them. So construction times are always a bit of a variable, but there is an urgency to that construction. But I'm very pleased ultimately that they have made that investment. That's an expression of confidence in the flow of fiber that will be necessary over the long term to make that mill operate. And they are convinced that by making that investment, they have the possibility of making future profits and reinvesting here in British Columbia. So it's all good news in my view.
I have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to have one last question, and I think I'll let Minister Heyman wrap it up. And I'm targeting this question because everyone has asked it, and it's been a key theme of the conference. What is the plan to streamline and simplify the environmental assessment process to make it shorter, more predictable, yet still robust? How can we shorten the timelines and costs?
Thanks. I welcome the question, and I'll try to leave enough time for one more, in fact. First of all, the 2018 Act was designed to be faster, and while one approval of a project, most of the ones we're dealing with were older ones, does not necessarily indicate success, it did happen much more quickly than other projects. And we tried to do that by encouraging what a number of proponents were already doing, and that's consultation and collaboration with First Nations at the front end to avoid litigation and multiple project redesigns. We're coming up to the 5-year review of the Act. We'll be looking at a number of things to change it and make it more effective based on experience. I would like to see greater use of regional assessments. I think the work that Minister Cullen is doing with cumulative effects will help answer a lot of questions before getting into the environmental assessment process. I'd like to see more use of class assessments, so when we know that the impacts of a certain class of industry are common in all regions, that we don't redo it and redo it and redo it. We focus on conditions that are unique to a particular nation, set of nations, or geography.
Great ideas. One last question, and it's about the mining industry, so I'll take that prerogative. How is the BC government working to balance, where'd it go? It jumped around on me. Balance initiatives to create more protected areas in the province and still develop new critical mineral projects? And I guess that's another question for you, Minister Osborne. And maybe give us some hints on what's coming in the critical mineral strategy.
Thanks. Actually, this is a question that could be addressed to almost any minister who's up here on the panel,
Absolutely.
because talking about the need to create protections in the province and the need to also build the resource industries, whether it's forestry or mining or agriculture or oil and gas. Fundamentally, this comes down to working with First Nations and the work that Minister Cullen is leading on land use planning, and to continue that, to create the certainty that industry, that First Nations and that communities are looking for, and to really begin to wrap our heads around a new way of thinking about what a protected area means. And, gone, I think, are the days of a historical, lines that are painted on a map, literally, that say, people shouldn't go in here or people shouldn't do any kind of activity there, and understanding that there are ways we can work together with the environment and taking the lead from Indigenous-led conservation projects, working with them on co-management and shared decision-making to gather with the resource industry to make decisions about where that activity can take place. We know, because First Nations tell us over and over, they want to see more economic benefits for their communities. We owe it to all of us to create that certainty and to do this work together. And Minister Cullen really is leading a lot of that work, and the rest of us are there very much supporting him. Thank you.
30 seconds.
So we see how this is all tied in, right? That in order to have good capacity building, particularly on First Nations government, we have to do a better job on revenue sharing. This helps First Nations out, clearly, but it also, I would argue, helps out industry and the BC government. We have a 30 by 30 target that BC has committed to, 30% of the land and water protected by 2030. It's the most ambitious target, I'd say, in the world. Pretty close to the world, certainly in North America. But in order to do that, what Josie was talking about means we have to have comprehensive land use planning so that we know where the areas that are being protected, we know the areas where Indigenous values are being presented and need a different model, and also giving predictability of industry that we're not going to permit you into areas that we know are going to be filled with conflict and strife, which the government has done over and over again in BC's history. And I've talked with industry leaders and why did you permit me in here if you knew that this was going to only lead to lawsuit and conflict and other things? So our job is to be the ones who convene as government. Our ministry is built to do that as well with all of our partners here, to make sure that we're telling you and working with First Nations and reconciling the land question. Where is it that values of protection need to be upheld? Are we building the capacity up so that we can agree on the science and the data, bring in Indigenous knowledge, and achieve conservation goals, which I hope we would all be collectively proud of, right? As industry, as government, as people of British Columbia, because it's such a beautiful place. We shouldn't ruin it. We should leave it better than we found it, ideally. That's our job as government, and also provide that predictability that we've all been talking about here today so that folks can invest and do it in a partnership and a collaborative way so that we can access the $53 trillion of ESG money that's available in the world and do it with that ambitious entrepreneurial mindset that's cognizant of the rights and title holders of this territory so that we can finally reconcile these long-standing issues.
Thank you, Minister. And the zero button is long past, so I'm going to wrap this up and just please give these ministers an incredible round of applause for some great conversations. So thank you so much.
Amazing. That was a fantastic session. And so I'd now like to call up Joe Mazza, the Vice President of Energy Supply and Resource Development with Fortis BC, who's going to thank our ministers and moderator.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Chief Logan for the warm welcome yesterday to the traditional lands of the Tl'ae'lituq First Nation. It is an honor to join you here in Prince George. It is my pleasure to thank our outstanding panel this morning of provincial ministers. Thank you very much. It has been encouraging to hear about the province's commitment to building a cleaner economy by mitigating the impacts of climate change, seeking reconciliation and opportunity for Indigenous communities, and addressing affordable and reliable energy for British Columbians. At Fortis BC, we share these priorities. As the largest energy distributor in the province, delivering electricity and renewable and natural gas to over 1 million customers, we know that it takes all of us, industry, First Nations, and government, to move forward in decarbonizing our economy. We have been proud to partner with the provincial government on a number of renewable energy projects. Earlier this week, we joined the Premier and Ministers Osborne and Heyman to announce the Terrelta Hydrogen Project, along with Chemtrade here in Prince George. Just yesterday, we announced a joint study with the province and Enbridge looking at the reliable delivery of hydrogen using existing natural gas infrastructure. There's exciting work happening to move us to a low-carbon future, and forums like this serve as a fantastic opportunity for collaboration and learning from one another. Minister Osborne reminded us yesterday that we are all in this together, a fitting sentiment for our gathering, and that certainly came through in the panel today, so very much appreciated. It is always a pleasure to sponsor the annual BC Natural Gas Forum, and this year is no exception. Thank you again to our resource ministers, Minister Osborne, Mr. Heyman, Minister Ralston, Minister Rankin, Minister Bailey, and Minister Cullen. Thank you very much. And thank you to our moderator, Carolyn, for a thoughtful discussion, and to the BC Natural Resources Forum for a fantastic breakfast today. Thank you very much.